Welcome, everybody. Walter McKenzie with The Worthy Educator, welcoming you to part 4 of our Rooted in Resilience, Promise Sensitive Teaching the Transform series with Elisa Hong and Serenity Moore. This excellent professional learning series is possible through a partnership between The Worthy Educator and TransformED. TransformED is an organization dedicated to cultivating and transforming leaders, inspiring them to tap into their potential, embrace equity, create a collaborative and inclusive culture, and foster the growth and development of staff. And Elisa and Serenity, you have personified that through all 4 sessions. It's an honor to be here tonight to end on a high note as we get into honoring communication, building trust, and partnering with others in the community as part of trauma-sensitive teaching. How are you two?
We're great. It's so good to be here for the fourth and final session in the series.
Absolutely.
Yes, Walter, very happy to be here, and we're ready to bring this content home to
All
the
right.
participants in the Zoom. We're excited.
All right, so let's get started. Thank you all for joining us. We see some folks that have been here over the last several sessions, so it's so good to see all of you virtually. And for those of you that are watching the recording later, we certainly hope that you've been able to watch the previous 3 recordings as we build into our fourth and final session. And this time around, we're really talking about ways that we can, not just as educators interacting with students, but as a school community, how can we cultivate and create culturally responsive, trauma-informed schools? Elisa Hong here again, and then my wonderful partner. Do you want to do a quick introduction before we get into it?
Sure, I'm really thankful again to be back. Like I said earlier, I'm very excited. My name is Serenity Moore, and I have the pleasure of being here with both Walter and Elisa.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so let's get started with just a little quick recap of where we've been. Serenity is going to just do a brief little review, and then we'll talk about that piece about culturally responsive, trauma-informed school communities.
So a theme of what you've heard us discuss over this series is that we have to Maslow before we bloom. And so I just want to take a little bit of time and just let that sit with you. Maslow before we bloom. And so ultimately what that means is that we as educators, we have to center students' most basic and emotional needs before we can expect any learning to occur. Their basic emotional needs have to be met before we can begin to pour into them academically. Second, we can't expect academic excellence if a student is hungry or unsafe or anxious. Those emotions don't allow students to absorb education and learning the way that we know that they can when they are in a space that is safe and is nurturing and where they feel valued. Maslow's hierarchy of needs includes safety, it includes belonging and esteem, and it indicates that all 3 of those are foundational to what students need to be in a culturally safe and responsive classroom. And only once these needs are taken care of can we then focus as educators on the higher order learning. So again, I just want to frame that or frame those talking points around Maslow before Bloom. So when you see a student coming in, or even a family that is supporting a student coming into your space, you first want to make sure that they are ready and able to learn and to receive whatever information you have designed for them during that particular learning session. And so next, Elisa is going to talk to you a little bit about brain development and how those ACEs impact those situations.
Thank you. So we really have been honing in on this idea of Maslow before Bloom to provide the perspective and approach that schools do more than teach children reading, math, science, and such, right? That we are accepting and understanding that children come to us as people, little people, but people, right? And that schools have to be aware of the whole child, and that's understanding that before someone's ready to learn something academically, there has to be certain things in place. And those are the things that Serenity reviewed. So something else that we have been talking about for several sessions now is the impact of trauma, right? And adverse childhood experiences can add to a child's profile in terms of how they are impacted by trauma. And the good thing about what we know about ACEs is that although many children have them, right, there's a protective factor. Caring adult relationships can buffer the stress and build resiliency in students. So it's almost, I mean, it's not exactly, but I like to think of it as an antidote, right? So there are things that are happening outside of the school, whether it's in the home environment or in the community, that can have an adverse impact on our children. But when they come to school within our sphere of influence, we can be almost an antidote for those children by providing healthy, caring adult relationships. And that's where we want to sit with today, thinking about that piece about school as a community and that family and community engagement piece, right? Caring adults. It doesn't say teachers, right? The research speaks to how a protective factor is a caring adult. So it can be a counselor, right? It could be the school secretary. It could be the classroom teacher. It could be the school administrator. It could be a building service worker or maintenance worker, right? Caring adults in a community can provide a buffer to the stress and trauma that students can experience outside of the school. And so one quick thing that we always point out when we're talking about trauma-informed approaches to education is that we want to work within our area of expertise. We are not therapists, unless you are a clinically trained therapist. We are, Serenity and myself, we are teachers and administrators, right? So we want to operate within our area of expertise. So we never go into these situations looking to discover or uncover facts about the trauma. That's not our place, right? Let the professionals handle that. What we can do is be that caring adult, model the healthy relationship for the children.
And as adults, we want to make sure that we are transitioning from that ABC to having an asset-based approach. And this is really about working as an individual, and if you are a school leader, working with your staff to transition to an asset-based approach. And so just as a reminder, an asset-based approach really focuses on recognizing and building up the strengths, the knowledge, and the cultural resources that students and families bring to a school community. We are functioning under the assumption that these students and families have information that is important to the learning process, have strengths that are important to the learning process. And so when you are approaching things using an asset-based approach in education, there are some key elements that we want to center. So we want to just take a moment to highlight those. So first, we have to believe at our core that students have unique skills, that students have resilience, and that students have a wide range of talents. That needs to be a fundamental belief of the educators and the educational leaders in a schoolhouse and all the way up through central services. A second key element is that we have to believe that families and communities hold wisdom and cultural wealth. And in addition to understanding that families and communities hold wisdom and cultural wealth, we have to have a desire to want to tap into that wealth to understand it better. A third key element is learning experiences must be connected to the students' lived experiences. We don't want to be creating learning experiences that are disconnected from what the students see day to day, what the families see day in and day out. We want to make sure that we are able to connect our learning so that it stays with them. It moves over to that long-term memory because it is connected through multiple ways to their lived experiences. Now, in order for you to design learning so that it is connected to their lived experience, you have to be in relationship with them. And we're going to come back to that in a couple of slides, but that is a critical factor of being able to create these lived experiences is that you have to know who your students are. You have to know them as individuals, and you can't paint them with a broad brush. So all of these things together really lead us to our last core value or key element, which is that we are shifting from the mindset of looking at a child, looking at a student and saying, what's missing? Instead, we are leaning in and we are looking at the student and we're saying, what is present? And once we identify what is present, then as highly skilled educators, we have the ability to build on the talents, the skills that these students have in front of us. So again, which overlays Elisa's point from before, the asset-based approach really is about empowering students by centering their strengths and positioning families as collaborators and partners in the learning.
Thank you, Serenity. That's really what we wanted to talk about tonight, is this asset-based approach to education. There's a very famous quote from, I believe, an Irishman. Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. It's by an Irish poet named William Butler Yeats. Think about that, right? You know, what we're doing is looking at this glass of water, right? From a deficit mindset, you would say that it's half empty, right? From an asset or an more optimistic point of view or perspective, you would say it's half full. And that's what we want you to do in terms of your mental model for understanding students and school communities. It's not looking at what's missing or what's wrong or what is the deficit here in terms of students' individual learning profiles, but more of what is here and what can we build on. And that quote about education not being the filling of a pail, but rather the lighting of the fire, parallels that idea, right? When you're looking at symbolizing learning or a student as an empty vessel and that you're filling the pail, what you're saying is that the student brings nothing to the table. The student brings, there's nothing of value that the teacher or the school holds all the wealth and knowledge and all the good things, and you pour into a child. And that's an old school way of thinking. But the lighting of the fire more is that, you know, the elements were already there, right? It didn't say, the quote doesn't say that you're building a fire, but you're lighting the fire, right? So all the ingredients are there. It's just that the school or the teacher comes in, the community comes in and inspires. It's a catalyst for something greater, burning beautifully comes to life. So that's the perspective that we encourage you to approach working with students and working in schools as, right? What does the community have to offer? What do the children have to offer? How can we build on it and build something even more beautiful and transformative? So that is what we mean by this culturally responsive, trauma-informed approach to school communities. We're looking at it from an asset-based lens. Okay, so what does that mean, right? So on the left-hand side, what you're going to see is just a quick overview of what an asset-based approach in schools looks like, right? We're looking at it from that more optimistic, what strengths are here perspective. We are focusing on and recognizing that there are strengths to build upon, right? There's already knowledge and cultural resources within the students and families, and they bring that to the school community. Serenity spoke to this, but it's about that piece about empowering students by taking advantage of, leveraging their strengths, and partnering with families in the learning. Previous session, we talked about the value and importance from that school to home connection, and that is critical, right? And so this asset-based approach, when you look at it, you're like, yeah, it all makes sense, right? And we connected it last time a little bit to that idea of funds of knowledge. There's some overlap here, right? Some parallels, right? And we know that kids come to school with learning, cultural learning, right? Cultural strengths. They all have things that they bring into the classroom and the schools the minute they walk in. And we challenge you, not just the teachers, right? But everyone in the school, right? Whether it's the cafeteria, the media center, or the counselor's office, everyone can draw upon students' real life experiences to create schools that are more relevant and engaging for all students. So we're moving away from a deficit view towards more of a culturally responsive, equity-driven approach. Because when you say, not that the kid comes to school and I'm going to teach them the right way to do anything, right? Learning, or the right way to behave, or the right way to act, right? You're becoming more culturally responsive in that moment when you're thinking more about, hey, let me learn more about the social, cultural norms of our family communities, and how can we interweave that with what we are trying to achieve at school, which is tapping into and maximizing each individual child's potential.
Thank
And
you.
so with that, in the back of your mind, Serenity is going to walk us through something called the equity-centered trauma-informed approach to education. And there's 4 specific priorities that you, looking at it from not just the classroom teacher's lens, but just more holistically from the school community lens, we want you to walk through this piece thinking about the larger school community versus just a classroom.
Thank you, Elisa. Sorry to step on your toes.
No,
So
sorry, I got ahead of myself.
yeah, she's teeing me up perfectly. It's wonderful to have a dynamic partner. So, to Elisa's point, right, there are 4 priorities that we really need to stay focused on if we are really going to ensure that we are creating spaces that can be adequately identified as equity-centered and trauma-informed, right? So it's one thing to call a thing a space that, it's another thing to live it and breathe it, particularly when you see a student who is showing up in a way that really exhibits some behaviors that we are really just trying to help heal. And so Vanette's work is on these priorities. And so I just want to take a moment and walk through the 4 because this is really powerful learning, but we have to figure out what are the moves that we have to make when we are faced with students and families that have experienced trauma. And so there are some themes that we need to stick to. So the first priority is predictability. Students do want to be held accountable, and it is important for us as educators to have routines, expectations, and structures that are consistent in the classroom and in our school buildings. Those routines and expectations, when they are clearly communicated, they create predictability, and predictability helps students feel safe. A second piece under predictability is when we create spaces where students understand, here is the standard, here is the expectation. They understand what those progressive consequences are, whether they be positive or negative. It helps a student reduce their anxiety. And what it does is it provides stability for the learner who may have experienced chaos or trauma in the past. So often we think, particularly when we're young, let me just say what I thought when I was young. I thought, hey, if I could be the cool teacher, right, I'll just show all this flexibility and, I'll give kids, 70,000 tries and that will benefit them. But the reality is what that means is when I hit a wall and then I go all the way to 10 with my consequence, the student is then thrown off center. And so the very thing that I'm trying to do, which is build a strong relationship, I'm actively working against. And so predictability and accountability, students know teachers who are holding them at a high standard, and they respect that even when they don't say it. They understand that you care about them, you come in prepared, and that you have structures and routines that are working to move their learning forward. The second priority is flexibility. Recognizing that a student's needs and responses to stress are unique. So you may have had a student last year that had a particular type of trauma. That doesn't mean that every student who walks through your doors will demonstrate behaviors that were similar because they had a similar experience. So we do have to be flexible. And I know you might be saying, well, you just said, make sure you're clear and accountable so that things are predictable. Yes. And we are professionals. We are experts. We are highly effective. We are practicing this every day. So we can be predictable and we can provide flexibility to ensure that we are meeting the needs of students who are coming through our doors. And again, because we are teachers and because we are constant reflective practitioners, We are working to adapt our strategy. So when we apply a strategy to a student and it doesn't quite work the way we intended, then we are making real-time adjustments. We are providing supports. And again, we are clearly communicating those expectations to ensure that we are doing everything possible to meet students where they are. The third priority is connection. It is imperative that there is a strong and supportive relationship between educators and students. That is central to this work. None of this works if we do not have healthy relationships with our students and our families. That connection that we work to not only create, but to sustain, it fosters belonging. It fosters trust. It builds resilience. And most importantly, what that connection does is it counteracts the isolation that trauma often brings. So if you have an educator, a teacher who's saying, hey, you hired me to teach chemistry. I don't have to do all of this soft stuff and making sure kids are okay. They do. We have to Maslow before we bloom, right? That is cyclic here. We have to Maslow before we bloom. And so, I ran into this. I've been a leader with science teachers for a good portion of my career, and we are notorious for leaning in on the content because we have a strong belief that we have the most important content. And there is also a bias often, not always, often, that everybody shouldn't be a scientist. Only the brightest and the best should be in this field. And so what that does is that allows educators, and that could be applied to math, ELA, etc., but that provides us an excuse to not meet students where they are. Instead of meeting students where they are, we say, hey, that person's not cut out to be a doctor. And we only want this particular type of kid to be a doctor. And I'm here to say that we have to break that down because we are dealing with young people that are 15 years old. I won't ask anybody to come off mute and share potentially how ridiculous they might have been at 15, but let me say up front, at 15, I was pretty much a hot mess, okay? And so I needed educators to pour into me and continue to send positive messages to me to let me know that I could do things that were even outside of my own individual scope. The fourth piece is empowerment. We want to make sure that we are designing learning spaces where students are given voice and they're given choice, and we are really creating meaningful and robust opportunities to influence their learning. This empowerment also counters the disempowerment that trauma often causes. If we can create situations, learning experiences where students have the ability to demonstrate empowerment and we are allowing them to be empowered in their own learning, that means we are making active choices to support their agency and to promote their growth. So these 4 priorities help us as educators shift the focus from controlling behavior to creating learning environments where students feel safe, they feel valued, and they're capable of thriving in our spaces where we can get them to a point where they are ready to learn. And so these priorities become critical, particularly as they continue through their academic journey. So next, what Elisa is going to unpack is how this connects to co-regulation and how co-regulation plays into preparing a student to be ready to learn.
Thank you, Serenity. And I love what you shared about science community teachers. And we're not saying that all science teachers are that specific way. That was just a personal anecdote from Serenity. But Serenity, you essentially shared that shifting from a deficit mindset about students when you said that, only if the brightest will rise, the cream will rise to the top, and then everyone else, if they just can't do it, right? That's a deficit mindset. And I know that you worked in your school building to shift that perspective to have your teachers that you supported have an asset-based approach, right? So I love that. That is just one way that this can look, even shifting something small as saying, hey, like everyone can access this learning and everyone can be successful is that small but large shift towards having more of an asset-based approach, right? So again, just like we talked about last session, some of these things are it's really small shifts that have large impact. And this is another one. So co-regulation. Okay, so when you want what I want you to think of is you can lean on your own personal experience, being a little baby, then a child, then a teen, and then a young adult and adult, right? Think about your experiences as an infant or a young child, when you were emotionally dysregulated, whether that's being angry, upset, crying. What happened? There was a grown-up who came and comforted you, right? That is what co-regulation is. And the comfort that they provide is that the adult comes and helps regulate your emotions and your feelings. So that, remember, we've talked about this idea of being in your upstairs brain or your downstairs brain. So think about when you're in your downstairs brain, right? It doesn't matter what the trigger was or what happened, your personal experiences, right? As a child, someone came and they comforted you, and that is essentially an adult helping to move you from dysregulation to regulation. So moving you from your downstairs brain, where you're just on survival mode, back into your upper brain, right, where rational thinking and such can take place. And this is a thing that all humans need. It's developmental. And the co-regulation process is very important for everyone and everywhere. The thing that we want you to shift when you're thinking about how do we become more trauma-informed, knowing that trauma-informed practices, honestly, are almost best practices. It's going to be beneficial for a lot of students in your building, a lot of children in your schoolhouse. Co-regulation has a place in schools. We have to shift away from saying that they're old enough, they should know by now, right? When you're calmed down, then we'll talk, right? If they knew how to calm down, I'm going to argue that they would have calmed down on their own, right? And you as the adult, that caring adult, that you can buffer, right, the stress and buffer trauma, the impact of trauma, and build resiliency. The key to that is co-regulation. Now, I'm not telling you that you as a high school science teacher need to rock a baby like a teenager like a baby. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I want you to think about is the children in your building or in your care, whether they're young kids, whether they're elementary, middle schoolers, or high schoolers, you got to think about what's developmentally appropriate. Okay, so that's context is different for everyone, but what's important is that we don't miss this critical part of co-regulation. And what does that look like? It means that when you see a student or a child that's dysregulated, that you're providing a calm and connected presence, right? That you're there with them, helping to regulate their emotions by modeling it and by being there, whether it's talking it through with them or just sitting side by side, that quiet presence, right? You can also validate their feelings, being a good listener, acknowledging, right? And this is, I think, can be hard for some adults, right? Like if there's a kid that has displayed defiant or disruptive behaviors, we get into a space where we're like, you shouldn't have done that, that was wrong, right? But it's okay, like you can give them the small win, right? Acknowledge your feeling. I see that you're very upset, right? That's not, it's gonna free you from saying like, I can't even, like they're wrong. They like tore my bulletin board down, or they threw a chair, like, well, we're not gonna condone any of that. I'm not asking you to condone the behavior, just validate their feeling, because what you want to do is you need to calm them down. You have to co-regulate, right? And then with them, you want to problem solve, right? So the idea here is that you're not just a pacifier, right? But what you want to do is that think about what we know about like a gradual release of independence. If they need just a comforting figure, again, depending on how old the child is, it will look different, right? So the little ones may need a hug, right? The older ones, they just, hey, I'm sitting right here with you. Tell me when you're ready. Like, man, this must be hard. I understand. I can see that this is really challenging for you, right? Those are just be present. And then you also want to teach them, guide them through the process of how they can begin to regulate on their own. That problem solving part is critical, right? So you want to talk with them, think about, hey, like what's going on here? I see that you're upset. Like maybe do you want to take a walk with me? Like walking helps me calm down. Do you want to walk with me? Maybe it'll help you calm down, right? That's that idea of problem solving, right? Giving them strategies, modeling and teaching them how they can regulate. Because ultimately what you want to be able to do is move from co-regulation to independent emotional regulation, but that's going to be a process. And so this idea of co-regulation is something we really wanted to talk to you all about because um, if we can free ourselves from the idea and concept that we are controlling the environment to a space where we are in it together, we go from a space of deficit. If we see a behavior, right, that it's weird, the deficit mindset might be right where we go. That kid is bad. It's doing it again. She doesn't know how to, right? Of course she doesn't know how to. If she knew how to, she wouldn't. So then we can shift our thinking into this concept of, hey, they're a child. Some are large children, 17-year-olds. I always say 18-year-old until you're 18, you're still a child. You can be 6 feet 5 inches tall and you're still a child, right? It's children in big bodies, right? But shift that mindset to, hey, let me help this child through this moment. Let me walk them through. Let me be that caring adult. Let me model the behaviors. That is going to be such a radical shift and radical impact in your schools. So co-regulation is really just about helping children process their emotions, regulate themselves, and you as the adult stand in that space where you are a teacher in that moment too. You are absolutely a teacher. You're not teaching them content, but you're teaching them critical life skills. And so that piece about the ABC chart, right? We talked about how like an escalation cycle, that's all connected here, right? The idea of like as behaviors escalate, you stand in that space to help bring them back to calm is that co-regulation piece. So it's all interconnected, but we challenge you to embrace co-regulation. Don't let go of it. I think in elementary and preschools, it's easy to believe in this concept, but even as we move into middle school and high school levels, co-regulation is going to be such an amazing tool that you can use with your students to create really positive learning spaces. Okay, and so with that, that really wraps up this little piece about the 4 priorities and co-regulation and creating these equity-centered, trauma-informed school spaces. And what we want to do now, the last part, is really just talk about what does this look like? What can this look like in school? So what Serenity is going to take you through is essentially a chart that's going to give you guiding questions and a moment of reflection about whether it's your classroom or school, what do I do right now? It's almost like a checklist. So when we go on to the next part, what we want you to think about is wherever your educational space is, almost like a checklist, like what do I do? What do I currently have in as a structure? What can I shift? What do I need to add? Okay, so we really want to shift this from just learning about the ideas and concepts to what does this mean for me in my setting. So Serenity, all yours.
Thank you for that lead in. See, I'm a quick learner. So again, all of this is really around relationships and trust. And we cannot do this work if we don't have sustained relationships with our students. And so a guiding question around that is, do families feel seen, heard, and respected? And look at those quick checkpoints. Do you start with positive messaging about their student or their child? Do you use two-way communication mechanisms? Do you build connections through home visits or community walks? So just take a moment to think about that. I'm thinking about in high school, my goal for the first month was to call every parent. High school, you have about 100, 150 students, right? 30 kids, 5 classes. But my goal and the standard I set for myself was to call every parent before I called them to say I had a concern. And I would call and say how wonderful Elisa was, how fantastic Walter was. And the kids would say, who are you calling? Where are you calling from? You calling from what school? Oh, about what? You know, it would really put them on their heels. And so when I did, or if I had to call, right, they were more open to receive my feedback and they understood that I was rooting for their kid. And when I got to class, I said, some of you all received some phone calls and the kids would jump up. Yep, I got a good one. Yep, I got a good one. And so that spreads good energy too and helps you create positive and strong relationships with both your students and your families. Second is communication, language, and access. So can the schools, or do you have access to language lines? And so just looking at those checkpoints, are you making those decisions when you know that a student speaks another language to just take the extra 3 minutes to get the language line together and be able to communicate what you need to communicate to that parent in a way that doesn't create stress and anxiety for them? The third is cultural responsiveness and inclusion. Do school spaces and practices reflect families' cultural backgrounds, right? This is more than just putting flags up in your classroom. This is about, are you really making authentic changes in how you move to ensure that people feel seen and that their cultures are respected? Do you have a student that you could give community service learning hours to help you translate some of the posters and the signage in your classrooms and in your schools? Think about how you can use the students to help you build up the resources that you need. This isn't always about having money or the resources to buy posters in 6 different languages. How can you pull the families and the students in by saying, this is important to me. Can you help me with this? Shared power and co-leadership. A mistake that we do as school leaders is we make the decision and we think we're being culturally responsive when we go and tell the group that we made the decision for first. Shared power and co-leadership is about pulling them in to the planning process when you identify the problem. Hey, you all, we got a problem. Let's partner together while this is messy. I don't want to plan for 6 months to bring it to you for you to recognize immediately that the way we're going about it is not going to be effective. Bring the folks in. Next, this is about accessibility and flexibility. Are there engagement opportunities that are easy for families to access? Do you have back to school night only from 7 to 8? Have you ever experimented with it? We were working with the school district. They thought 7 to 8 was great because that's when all schools do back to school night. And they said, okay, our parents work. They took a risk and they ran their back to school night earlier. And what they found is they had an increase in attendance for the exact target populations that they were trying to engage. Because those populations said when it was later, it was harder with the childcare, with dinner, it just was too much. But I can get right off of work. We can kind of really just pull it together for an hour to run through back to school night, and we can make this happen. So take a risk. Have you ever even surveyed your families and said, what time is best for you to come? No, we typically have done back to school night from 7 to 8 because it's been done that way for 10 or 15 years. And then finally, community partnerships. Is your school connected to trusted community groups? Are you partnering with organizations that do real work to support the populations that you are trying to connect with? Are you sharing resources? And that could be information, that could be food resources, that could be banking, housing resources. Now you might be sharing resources about safety and what is appropriate during this really complicated time that we are navigating as schools with students from diverse backgrounds. So this is just the first 6 domains, and I'm going to pass it to Elisa, who's going to walk through some additional domains that will give you some quick checkpoints also to help us do this work more effectively.
Thank you, Serenity. Thank you for unpacking those for us. Those were just a little, hopefully in your head, you're thinking, okay, check, do that. Oh, check. Could try to incorporate that. So the next slide is going to be very similar. It'll have domains and guiding questions, but what we see now are action checkpoints. So the previous slide, hopefully you were just going through, thinking of what was happening in your spaces, taking stock of things. The action checkpoints you'll see in the third column are more action-oriented items. And what you can do here is think about things that you could implement maybe in the next 3 weeks, maybe in the next few months, in each of these domains. These domains really are going to move you in towards that space of being a equity-centered, trauma-informed, culturally responsive school community. So what you see in the domains 1 through 6 are the same domains as you saw on the previous slide, and we'll look at 7 in a second, but just go ahead, look through the relationship, trust, and safety domain, thinking about whether families feel emotionally safe and valued in your school settings. And if you're thinking, I could do better in that space, take a look at the action checkpoints. Hey, I can begin interaction with strengths and care. Again, that asset-based approach to interactions. That's something I could commit to, right? Maybe it's an issue of building trust and you want to build trust through making it known and very clear that there's follow through on commitments, right? Maybe that's an action you could take. Or maybe you want to launch yourself into a space where you are leading with empathy and not with judgment. That's really what we want you to do on this slide. So just go ahead. I'm not going to read through all of them because Serenity did a great job just unpacking each of the domains 1 through 6. Just take a moment, read through the domain action checkpoints and think about in each domain some things that you could commit to or do that are going to build these more positive spaces in your schools. So I'll give you a minute to do that. And then the final one, staff readiness and care. So this one is about professional development. So we're here because we are all committed to professional development and learning, right? You're here because you have a desire to learn more. I don't remember which session it was, whether it was the first or second session, but we talked about being lifelong learners and always reflecting. And 7 is about that, but more about the people that you work with, right? So just think about the staff or the people that you work with. Are we as a whole, or do we have the skills? Do we have the knowledge to engage with students and families with compassion? Okay, if you're not there yet, or you're thinking we could do better, we've started but can do better, take a look at those action checkpoints. Do we need some more professional learning and training and development on what trauma-informed and culturally responsive practices are? You could be a launch pad for that, right? Like you are taking a lot of information away here. Maybe you could have some conversations. Maybe you could lead a training at your school, right? Is it even a thing where we even just reflect on our practices, and are we even aware of our biases? If not, that's something that you could try to incorporate or implement at your school, engaging in practices where we reflect on how we move, how we engage, looking at implicit biases and how that can show up. Is it a space where people are so burned out themselves? Their well is dry, therefore they cannot pour into others. So we have to address burnout. So we have to take care of ourselves so we can care for others. Those are some possible actions, right? So 1 through 6, you're really just thinking about how do you build these spaces. And the final one is knowing that like the village has to be strong. The village has to be able to do this for the community. And how do we get the village strong? And with that, that really just wraps up our series. We wanted to move from a space of, hey, we did this. And it was really a powerful experience to, hey, what are the elements and the whys of doing the things we did, to finally a space of how can you shift mental models, paradigms, cultures, practices at your school. And so we just want to say thank you for coming along this journey with us. We've thoroughly enjoyed our time together. And we're going to wrap the last session up with a nice, lengthy question and answer session.
Well, thank you both. And what a wonderful way to bring it all together by emphasizing that community aspect to all of this. I know, and the charts especially were very specific. When we think about community connections to schools, we automatically think of public health. We think of social services. We think of those services that naturally lend themselves to schools. Is it too far of a stretch to think of, fraternal organizations like Kiwanis or VFW or, other businesses in a community that provide time for their employees, release time to work in schools and make those connections? What has your experience been here in the greater DC area working in schools? And what does that look like when you're able to get organizations beyond the public health and the immediate community services to be more engaged in schools? How does that help with trauma-informed practice?
Yeah, we, in the DMV area, we have
Yeah,
access to, all the public health things. And we also have access to those organizations that are held with high regard in communities, but might be smaller, right?
yes,
Might be individualized, right? Like might be focusing on immigrant families, maybe focusing on a particular cultural set, right? And so, um, what my experience has at least taught me is that when you can engage those niche communities and you can partner with those organizations who have a specific focus, it helps build trust, right?
yes,
Um, Parents, families, they want to turn their kid over to us as educators, and they want to
right.
trust that we are doing the very best that we can do to meet their kids' needs. When they see us going, and I know some people might say that's above and beyond, but for me, that feels like standard practice, right? To partner with organizations that these communities that you are serving already trust, to bring them into the fold, to be at back to school night, to be at baseball games, football games, to be a part of events. We used to have heritage shows, and we would bring in the community folks, and they say, "We're bringing in all the food for that night. We're
Yeah,
we're helping you sell tickets," and that just really ended up for us as sold out events, right? Like it was a big deal because not just students and families, but the organizations were bringing their members in, and they wanted to see their neighbors' kids perform. And so every event where we partnered with community organizations, we ended up with a more robust experience that was more meaningful, not just for the students and families, but for us as educators, because it put us in a position to learn, to see, for kids to show up in a different way. That kid that you're wrestling with in physics class shows up in this other space, and they're like dynamic. And so you can use that to build a relationship with them. Hey, I saw you crush it on the stage when you did X, and that
yeah.
helps bring that kid in. So, my experience has taught me that the more you partner with these organizations, the better and stronger the outcomes are for every individual that is in that scope or in that scenario.
I
That's great.
remember
That was a great
being,
response.
it was, thank you. And I want to kind of build on it if I can.
Yeah.
Um, Coming into a new district years ago and being in a district level meeting, and I remarked about some of the organizations in the community because I was the new guy. I was kind of like, oh, look at this. I didn't know this was here. And I was there. And I brought up the National Science Teachers Association. And there were literally people in the room that said, "Oh, I didn't know their headquarters was in our community." So all that to say, is it important to have someone to kind of spearhead this outreach into the community and building a knowledge base of who is in the community, who are these employers and associations and organizations? Because we all know teachers who are just champions for kids who are going to go find them for themselves. But we don't want them to just stay little pockets of excellence and little islands, little oases for in their classrooms. Any thoughts or any experience from what you've seen on how we make district-wide caregivers and stakeholders aware of what the resources are in our community?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we are in a very large school system. I think there's strengths and challenges when you are in that space. The
Yeah.
smaller school systems, I think, probably do a much better job of utilizing their local community.
Mhm.
I know that some ways that we've seen it work in a very large school system is that there can be just different district-wide experiences and
Yeah.
instances. Previously, there was essentially the district invited a bunch of businesses in for almost a career day or a field day, not a field day. That's not what I'm looking for. A career day, a field trip situation. And it was something novel that the school system had not tried before. And they worked with another local organization. They partnered with another local organization that already had structures and were in the area experts in this so that the school system wasn't starting from ground zero, but that they relied on a community partner that knew the business workforce intimately. And I think the school system did a phenomenal job of leveraging just kind of, knowing how to utilize different partners. So that's an example of, I think, it gets at your, how do we
Yeah.
engage the community? But the school
Yeah.
system might be limited in resources or may not have a direct person that's in charge of it. Or even if you do, like, how do you even begin to do that?
Right.
And partnering with other organizations, knowing who's in your community, I think is really just the key. And that just again, it's that village mindset. Like the school system doesn't have to do it all on
No.
their own, right?
No.
Know who's your neighbor, like you were saying, Walter, right? Like know who's down
Right.
the street and see if
Yeah.
you guys can have a conversation or talk about what are some things that we can explore creatively for the
Yeah.
sake of our communities. But yeah, it's just made me think of that, right? Like they wanted to
Yeah.
do X, even a large school system, they couldn't just figure it out, right? They had to rely on another partner. So
Yeah.
I love that you're saying that, Elisa. And what I also think is that when we are developing these new ideas, we
Yeah.
are always trying to go big or go home, right? It is okay for your first event to not have 32 community vendors there to support. You might just have 3,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And that's okay. Start small and then gain some momentum. We tried in our district with our new educator orientation. We created a community fair and it was smaller this year. We had just about 25 vendors that came. But in our feedback, those vendors each gave us additional vendors. We asked for it in the feedback. So
Sure.
next year, we'll have a wider swath that we can roll out to. So don't be afraid to take a risk and do something new and start small, right? And give yourself permission to build momentum and not come in hot at the very, very beginning. Yeah.
Great advice. The other piece you brought out that's really has profound implications is the idea of bringing in parents and stakeholders to help problem solve and to help make decisions rather than being reactive and saying, here, let me do you a favor and present a solution without vetting it first and getting
mhm,
input. What are the considerations if I haven't built that in my district yet, but I'm
mhm.
like, that makes a lot of sense. Well, what should we think about in terms of how you begin that, how you enlist that help, and are there any good recommendations for what to do or what not to do when you first learn how to bring in stakeholders to help you make those decisions and plan programs that try to solve problems?
Yeah. Do you want to take that, Serenity, or would you like me to?
You start and I'll bring up the rear.
Oh, okay, awesome. When I first started, I worked in a small private preschool,
Yeah.
and parents dropped off in the classroom and they picked up in the classroom. And I taught
Mhm.
kindergarten.
Yeah.
So I'm not talking about the 2-year-olds, right? I'm talking
Right.
about kindergartners, and parents walked in, walked to the classroom,
Mhm.
and walked out. And why I share that is I want to share that that was such a beautiful experience for me. And I taught there for 4 years, right?
Yeah.
Having the community in the classroom, I believe, was a strength
Yeah.
because the trust and also the support that I received from them is unparalleled because there was no gatekeeping, right? It's not that you end here and I start here, but we're here together.
Right.
They were extremely supportive of what I was trying to achieve in the classroom, and they would sometimes, without it asking, oftentimes without me even asking, proactively offer the help. So
Yeah.
that I think is something that I want to share, right? Because we're so used to saying, even the previous question that you asked, Walter, we were talking about like,
Right.
we need something, so how do we get the community on board to
Yeah.
help us? But what
Yeah.
I'm saying is, if the community is already there, they
Yeah.
innately know the needs of the school and
Yeah.
will support because like Serenity said, like, I mean, they're trusting us. They want the best for our children, and we
Yeah.
are serving their children. So just by default, we're like their child adjacent, right? They want the best for us because that's going to ultimately serve their student, or I mean their children well. And so I challenge everyone to not gatekeep their schoolhouses.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And that isn't that like magic that you just have built-in support because they're there every day and they see and believe in what you're doing. I mean, that makes perfect sense. Serenity, what do you think at the high school level?
Yeah, if I could add to that, because I love that. I would have loved to be able to come
I
into
know.
my kindergarten teacher's class, but it was during COVID, so we couldn't, nobody
Right.
could go anywhere. But
Right.
I would say, I think we jump into situations and we try to get to the business of the work too
Right.
soon. And the first step needs to be building trusting relationships with those community partners. We don't know what experiences they may have had with the school system, their kids may have had, their
Yeah.
parents may have had. And so our first goal needs to be really resetting that and
Hmm.
helping them see us as an individual
Yeah.
and helping them see us as an entity that wants to ensure the best for their child also. And so it's worth having a meeting and setting up some really quality community builders across cultures. Breaking bread is really important to engaging in those conversations. Can you have everybody bring a dish? Can we sit down and not jump into an agenda at our
Right.
very first touch? Because when I get to know you, Walter, I know that when you do make a mistake, there's some grace I'm going to give you because I remembered the conversation and the relationship we built last month when we
Yep.
met, right? I have more trust that you are really trying to figure this thing out as opposed to seeing you as an entity of that district. The second thing I think is making sure you are aware of who you're serving with respect to communication styles, right? There is
Yes.
a premise, right? Often school systems, they move like a business. You
Yes.
send a memo out, you send an email out, and you feel like I've done my job,
Right.
right? But there are many cultures that you demonstrate respect by coming in and saying,
Mhm.
here's what our thinking was. Let me hear your feedback on that. How can
Yeah.
we edit this? How can we communicate this to your community in a way that is meaningful, right? And that might look completely different for the community that's up the street.
Yes.
So I would argue that as educational leaders, we have to get curious. We can't assume that we know what to do all the time. And getting curious and asking questions and showing vulnerability really helps build trusting relationships. And so the more we do of that, the better partners we will become to the people we are entrusted to serve.
Words of wisdom. I can't thank you both enough. This was our first four-part series with the Word the Educator, and doing it with TransformED has been nothing but a pleasure. You're both consummate professionals, and the knowledge and experience you so willingly share. And I guess everybody should know, when I ask these questions, I'm popping questions out. You have had no prep. You're answering on the fly. This isn't like scripted, so you've just been so gracious and graceful about it, and really risen to the occasion each time.
Thank
So
you.
looking forward to a continued partnership with TransformED. Hoping to work with you again in the future, knowing we'll be in touch, and looking forward to following you as you continue the important work you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us. It was a pleasure to be here to represent Transform Ed, and we look forward to continued partnership.